Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is legendary investigative journalist Michael Isikoff, who is very famous, therefore he doesn't need any introductions because he has been covering a lot of different, very important topics over the last few decades. And together with Michael today, we'll cover the topic of his last book, that is Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the result of the U.S. elections in 2020. Thanks for your time, Michael. Thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Well, would you like to tell us something about what sparked your interest in this case? Because as I just mentioned, you covered a lot of very important cases over the last few years, decades. So this probably was one of them. Go ahead. How did this start?
Well, just for the benefit of your listeners and viewers, the book is called Find Me the Votes. And it's about Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And we focus, I and my co-author, Dan Klaidman, focus on what Trump was doing in Georgia in particular, because Georgia was the sort of ground zero for everything that unfolded afterwards, culminating in the events of January 6th. It was the crime scene. It was where Trump's efforts to overthrow the results of the election was most furious, most intense, and most consequential. And as we write in the book, this was arguably the most anti-democratic plot in American history. And we felt it needed fresh eyes and a fresh angle. And by looking at it through the lens of what took place in Georgia, I think you see the gravity and the extremity of what Trump was trying to do in ways that you would never have imagined if you were just following the story in the newspapers generally. Because once you put things under a microscope, the magnitude of it all comes into fresh focus.
Absolutely. This would be science fiction if we weren't talking about Donald Trump, which can make science fiction become reality. So this book is actually about an ongoing criminal investigation into him. So how did you guys investigate this? How do you develop sources and talk to people in an ongoing criminal investigations?
Well, it's called reporting, and you do your best. We spent a lot of time, Dan and I, down in Georgia, talking to the principals, talking to the folks in the Georgia government who were responsible for administering the election and counting the votes, the people around Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the person to whom Donald Trump made that infamous phone call to on January 2nd, 2021, in which he implored Raffensperger to find him 11,780 votes, just one more than was needed to flip the results of the Georgia election and put him in the top. We spoke to Raffensperger at great length. We spoke to people on his staff at great length, one of whom looms very large in this story, not somebody who was at all known to the public before we published this book, but as we document, this young staffer on Raffensperger's, actually Raffensperger's chief of staff, 30-year-old young woman who did what we say was the single gutsiest and most consequential thing in the entire post-election battle, and that was secretly tape that 62-minute phone call between Raffensperger and Trump. And as a result, we have the most compelling evidence of just how much pressure Trump was putting on state officials to demand that they follow his will and essentially rig the vote to put him on top. But even while we tell the story of that phone call in a way that it's never been told before, we also document everything else that Trump was doing during this period. The minions he had who were putting pressure at every stage of the way, the lies that his chief lawyer Rudy Giuliani, the blatant lies that Rudy Giuliani told the Georgia legislature about these two African-American poll workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, the entire fake electors scheme, the meeting in the state capitol in which Trump electors just anointed themselves as the legitimate electors from the state of Georgia, the pressure that Trump was putting on office holders across the board to have a special session of the legislature in which the Republican legislators could decree him the winner, regardless of what the actual vote count showed. All of that, when you put it together, you see the enormity of what was going on. And, as I said, we spent a lot of time there talking to the sources. We also spent a lot of time talking to Fani Willis and members of her staff, the Georgia district attorneys who was investigating and put together what we continue to believe is the most compelling of all the indictments against Donald Trump.
But what makes Georgia so special? I mean, you already said.
Well, as I said, Georgia was the crime scene. Georgia was ground zero. Georgia was all the players from January 6th started out what they were doing in Georgia. Sidney Powell, John Eastman, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, all the groups that congregated into Washington on January 6th were first at the state capitol in Atlanta, staging protests there, trying to put pressure on state legislators to do Trump's bidding. So, as I say, Georgia is special. Georgia was the crime scene.
Well, as you mentioned, Trump called the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and told him, "Find me the votes," which is the title of your book. But why does that recording even exist?
As I was explaining before, this young woman, Jordan Fuchs, secretly taped it and it didn't tell. Look, how that came about, chapter 8 in our book, is a fascinating story. Because the Trump people have been turning up the heat on Raffensperger from within days after the election, demanding that he resign, staging protests outside his home. The Proud Boys were casing his house. His wife was subjected to the most vicious messaging and text messages on her personal cell phone. The Raffensperger has had to flee their home over the Thanksgiving holiday in November of 2020. But then, as the clock was ticking and lawsuit after lawsuit by the Trump forces got rejected, and the deadline of the January 6th, the day that the Congress officially certifies the vote count and certifies the winner of the presidential election, was coming closer, the Trump people desperately needed a win. They needed to flip one state. If they could just get one state to flip, they figured they could muck up the works on January 6th and somehow get Trump over the top. And Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, calls Jordan Fuchs, Raffensperger's chief of staff, and says the president wants to talk to your boss. Can you set up the call for this afternoon? This is on January 2nd, 2021. And Fuchs and Raffensperger know the dangers of getting on the phone with Donald Trump, somebody who would almost certainly misrepresent anything that got said on that phone call. Plus, they were litigants. At that time, the Trump campaign was suing the Georgia Secretary of State's office. So another reason to be really wary. But on the other hand, this was a request from the President of the United States to speak to her boss. It was not something they felt they could just brush off and duck. And so Fuchs, on her own, makes that gutsy call to, without telling Raffensperger, without telling Meadows, without telling Trump, of course, to secretly tape the president. And I said gutsy before, it was also really risky because at the time, Jordan Fuchs was in Florida visiting her grandparents, and Florida is a two-party consent state. Um, in which, by law, you have to inform everybody on a call that they're being taped if you're going to tape it.
Mhm.
So Jordan Fuchs was risking criminal prosecution. And in fact, when the January 6th committee wanted to have her testimony, a lawyer from Raffensperger's office called them up and said, please don't call Jordan as a witness in your investigation. And they knew, the January 6 people knew why. They knew why, because of the secret taping in Florida. So that story never got told in the January 6 committee hearings. All those hearings, you never knew how they got the evidence that was so damning against Trump. But when Fani Willis's special grand jury called her as a witness and subpoenaed her, she was given immunity from prosecution and was allowed to testify and told the story of what she did. And as a result, and it's revealed for the first time in Find Me the Votes.
Well, tell us something about this Fani Willis, because she's the district attorney who started the criminal investigation, but her background is pretty interesting too, just to understand who she is and why she did what she did.
Yeah, just absolutely fascinating. And of course, became even more fascinating after the book came out with the revelations about her romantic relationship with the chief prosecutor, Nathan Wade. But yeah, Fani Willis is, as we write in the book, a force of nature. She was this young woman raised by her father, who's equally fascinating. Her father was a civil rights activist who became a gun-toting Black Panther, actually had a live-in relationship with a notorious figure in the Black nationalist community, Angela Davis, who was once on the FBI's most wanted list. But the father, John Floyd, shed his radical beliefs over time, became a lawyer, raised Fani Willis, and she got a job at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office and quickly became the star litigator in that office. I mean, she was a master in the courtroom, the premier homicide prosecutor in Atlanta. In fact, they used to tell young DAs when they joined the office, if you want to know how to do a homicide case, sit in and watch Fani Willis do it, because she has the juries eating out of the palm of her hands. And then she did her biggest and most consequential case of all, a Atlanta public school teachers case, cheating case, in which she indicted multiple administrators and teachers in Atlanta for cheating on the test scores of students. It was a hugely controversial case, and in fact divided the Black community in Atlanta, because all the defendants were people of color. But Fani Willis was determined. She believed that the case launched by her boss at the time was a valid case to bring, because it was cheating the students who were given test scores that they didn't deserve, and they kept getting promoted from grade to grade, even though some of them weren't even able to read. And she thought this was a huge disservice to the African-American community in particular in Atlanta. But it was hugely controversial, and she won, and that solidified her reputation as the premier litigator in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. And then in 2020, she ran for a DA herself against her old boss, who had been her mentor, Paul Howard. It was a bitterly personal case. And what's really interesting here is Fani Willis is not the prosecutor who liberals and progressives would like her to be and would like to celebrate. She was a She was and is a tough law and order person who believes, if you do the crime, you do the time. She's not one of these progressive prosecutors like we had in San Francisco and still have in LA and Philadelphia who believe in, doing away with bail and other measures to cut down on prosecutions and incarceration of violators. And in fact, when she ran in 2020, she was endorsed. Fani Willis was by the police union. And we was seen in our book where this Grammy award-winning rap figure, T.I., who's a huge political power broker in Atlanta, goes to her and says, look, you renounce the police union endorsement. You renounce the endorsement of Mary Norwood, a Republican activist in Buckhead, the sort of Tony affluent part of Atlanta, and give back their contributions, and I'll double your money. So in fact, he was essentially bribing her to renounce the endorsement of the police, of the cops in Atlanta. And you know what Fani Willis did? She said, no, I'm not going to do that. They're a part of my community, just like you're a part of my community. It showed her steel and determination. And like I said, she is not the prosecutor that a lot of progressives would like her to be. But from the get-go, she saw the Donald Trump case as a voting rights case that Trump was trying to deprive the citizens of Georgia and her community in Fulton County of validly cast votes, and she was determined to prosecute it.
Well, this lady also got death threats. Or she was what she was doing
unbelievable death threats. Yeah. In fact, the opening scene in our book is just hair-raising, where as we're coming close to the indictment in August, she's getting all bombarded with phone calls threatening her life. One from a computer disguised voice was threatening her kids. Her two daughters knew exactly what their names were and where they lived. And then as she's preparing to on the eve of the indictment, of announcing the indictment against Donald Trump, there's an assassination threat against her on a MAGA website, a dark web website, saying the best time to shoot her is when she leaves the building. So after that indictment, there's this extraordinary scene where she goes back to her office, takes off her business suit and pearls, and puts on sweatpants and a baseball cap, and a body double wearing a Kevlar bulletproof vest puts on the business suit, or something resembling the business suit that Fani Willis was wearing, and goes out in the car as a decoy while Fani Willis is smuggled out the back of her office to an undisclosed location to safety. Pretty extraordinary for a prosecutor, a publicly elected prosecutor, for just doing her job to have to flee her office under an assassination threat.
Well, in your book, you guys also mentioned the QAnon conspiracy theory. What does this have to do with all this story?
It is one of the wildest stories of this whole saga. The people who were challenging the election on Trump's behalf, and Trump himself, were adopting these crazed conspiracy theories of QAnon. QAnon believes that there's this international deep state cabal of sex traffickers and pedophiles who are secretly running the United States government and allied governments, and holding children as sex slaves underneath Central Park, and all sorts of crazy stuff. And yet Trump's lawyers, who were challenged in the election, bought into QAnon stuff, these QAnon conspiracy theories. Lynn Wood, somebody we write about quite a bit, brought in by Donald Trump Jr. to be the public face of Trump's legal assault in Georgia, was a full-blown conspiracy QAnon adherent, had bought into these crazed QAnon conspiracy theories, opens up his plantation in South Carolina called Tomatley to become a command center for the Trump folks who are for Trump's team challenging the election. Sidney Powell is there, Mike Flynn is there, Patrick Byrne is there, and piping in, zooming in from Japan, a guy named Ron Watkins, who was the administrator of the QAnon website. He was more responsible for this crazed QAnon messaging than anybody known in the world. Some people believe he may have even been Q himself, putting out these crazy conspiracy theories. And there he is, advising, contributing, participating in Trump's efforts to overturn the election.
Well, there's a chapter in your book that is very interesting and a little bit more optimistic about what you guys call the Stonewall. So the part of the Republican Party that was opposing Trump, one of which being Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually maybe the one slender reed of hope in this whole story, which is that when you ask, all these people, Brian Kemp, the governor, Chris Carr, the Republican Attorney General, Brad Raffensperger himself, the Republican Secretary of State, had all been Trump supporters. They had all endorsed him. They had all were viewed as being in Trump's camp, and they were. But when you ask people to actually cross the line and break the law, even Trump supporters, some of them are going to resist. And that's what you had in Georgia. Down the line, Raffensperger refused to buckle, stuck by the vote count. Chris Carr, the Republican Attorney General, is asked to, threatens to resign if Trump gets his way and gets a special session to the legislature, saying there's no way I'm going to defend that in court, having legislators pick the presidential electors over the will of the people. And Brian Kemp, who was the governor of Georgia and was just fed up with Trump and all his shenanigans, and just says, "F him," about Trump to one of his close associates, saying, "I'm not going to do his bidding. I know what he's doing is wrong."
Well, this whole thing brought to what happened on January 6th. What is the connection between Trump trying to overturn the election and the storming of the Capitol Hill?
Oh, I mean, it's direct. I mean, that's what it was all about. I mean, Trump was doing everything he can to stay in power despite the results of the election, right? And, they tried lawsuits, they tried pressure, they tried political protests, they tried everything they could come up with, and they were getting nowhere. I mean, that's why I was saying before, as the clock was ticking closer to January 6th, that's what triggers that phone call on January 2nd from Trump to Raffensperger. They needed a win somewhere. They needed to flip at least one state to create enough doubt so that Congress itself, Republicans in Congress, would do Trump's bidding and block the certification of Biden's victory. And then what January 6th was adding the protest. Trump calls for the Stop the Steal rally on the Ellipse that morning, then tells them to go march up to the Capitol. And it was all about creating enough commotion and enough of a sense of threat and anger that the Republicans in Congress would block the certification. Of course, they were hoping that Mike Pence would do the trick for them, because it's the vice president under the Constitution who officially counts the electoral votes, and Trump was putting unbelievable pressure on Pence to reject the vote count in the states that Biden had won, and Pence, like Kemp in Georgia, like Chris Carr in Georgia, like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, wasn't going to cross the line for Donald Trump.
I'm going to ask you to be a sort of a mind reader now. Do you think that Trump really believed that the election was being stolen?
I think Trump, is incapable of seeing boundaries between what's good for him and what reality is. So he bends reality to his own persona. And because it was in his interest to stay in office, because he cannot perceive to be himself to be a loser, because he's a winner, not a loser, he could not accept defeat. And so therefore he just, asserted a reality that was demonstrably and objectively false.
But well, let's go back to January 6th. How can someone like that group of psychotics who stormed the Capitol be so determined to follow their leader like that? This is a cult. This is not politics.
Right, exactly. And it is people who were just fed falsehoods, right? They were fed falsehoods about the election. I went back, I mentioned Rudy Giuliani before, who just, made these blatantly false assertions repeatedly before the Georgia legislature. That these two African-American poll workers had stuffed the ballots and that there was video evidence for it. This was something that was immediately debunked by the FBI, by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta, by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, by Raffensperger's office themselves. They all did a full investigation of this claim, and they all unanimously came back and said there's nothing to this. This is just a lie. There was no stuffing of the ballots in Fulton County, and there was no video evidence of stuffing the ballots. But you had Trump people loudly saying it, and then you put on top of that Sidney Powell and her completely cockamamie claims about how Venezuelan socialists had secretly planted an algorithm in the Dominion voting machines to flip votes from Biden to Trump. I mean, it was complete nonsense. There was nothing to base it on. And yet this gets loudly asserted, and, the Trump MAGA people hear it, and they're telling me it must be true. And you put all that together, and it leads to the events of January 6th.
But what impact can this criminal investigation have in case Trump is elected in November?
Well, interesting, because we're all obviously waiting for what the Supreme Court is going to say about immunity for a president, something that had never been considered to be a thing before, until Trump asserted that there might be immunity for a president from criminal prosecution. We don't know how the Supreme Court is going to come down on that. There's, indications from the oral argument last week that they're taking it seriously. But if the Jack Smith cases are delayed, then and Trump does win the election, it's almost certain that Trump would have his Justice Department drop those cases, and he'd be home scot-free. Those cases will never go to trial if Donald Trump is elected president. We have the New York case going on now. A lot of us, including me, think it's a really marginal case at best, that it just doesn't measure up to the, I mean, of all of Trump's transgressions, this seems the least serious and the least, and it will rest on a sort of shaky legal theory that I think will have this tied up in appeals as well. But the Georgia case can go forward because that's a state case. It's not a federal case, and Trump will have no power to drop the charges in that case. And it may be that he himself cannot be prosecuted while he's president because there's some longstanding legal doctrine that the Justice Department has adopted that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted while he's in office. But the case can still go forward against all his Confederates: Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Mark Meadows, David Schaefer, the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party, on down the line. It can all go forward, right? And then, ultimately, after Trump, if Trump is elected, he leaves office in 4 years. If he does, then the charges, the case against him in Georgia will be restored. Whereas once the federal cases are dropped by a Trump Justice Department, there's no reviving them.
Well, you're also an expert in Russians' interference in the Western world. So let's try to combine the two pieces. What should we expect in case Trump is elected? Because his ties with Vladimir Putin are scary. Because you already mentioned wanted to go get out of NATO and drop the helps to Ukraine. What should we expect in terms of world politics in case Trump is elected?
More chaos and more disruption for sure. Look, it's a mistake to believe that Trump is ideologically committed to any particular course of action. It's all transactional for him. It's all about him. Vladimir Putin is Trump's kind of guy. He's had this affinity for Putin for years, long before he became president. That's in part of what my previous book, Russian Roulette, was all about. And, his famous trip to Moscow in 2013 for the Miss Universe contest, where he's desperately eager to meet with Putin because he wants Putin's blessing for a business deal. He's trying to erect a Trump Tower in Moscow. And plus, Putin runs Russia the way Trump would like to run America, right? As an autocrat who gets his will and is not bothered by pesky political opponents, right? So I think that if Trump gets elected, it would not be a good day for Ukraine and continued Western support for Ukraine. Trump would almost certainly try to cut a deal with Putin. Now, at the end of the day, I mean, I got to say, as much as, the Russian, what Russia did in Ukraine was naked aggression, and there's no getting around it. The battlefield does seem to be pretty much frozen at this point, and there's no coherent strategy I can see for dislodging the Russians from Donbass and Crimea at the moment. So, we may end up with a deal one way or the other because at some point there's no getting around the facts on the ground there. So I'm a bit more skeptical than some in Washington that continued military aid to Ukraine is going to make the difference. What it may do is be just enough to, establish some kind of equanimity that could lead to a negotiated peace. But I think that's where we're ultimately going to be headed.
I don't think that that Putin wants to negotiate, actually. But
no, he certainly does not. But, I mean, if the military aid is enough to convince him that he can't take Kyiv, then, maybe that's the maybe that's where we'll end up. But there's nothing good about any of it.
Of course. Well, Michael, many thanks for your time and for your very precious explanations. I do recommend everyone to read your book. And after you read this book, don't stop and read the other.
Remind them what the name of the book is.
Find Me the Votes.
Okay, good.
I've read it.
All right. Thank you. And yeah, good to talk.
Well, thanks everybody for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.